Last night, Snowden sat down for an exclusive interview with NBC's Brian Williams in Moscow. It was Snowden's first U.S. television appearance. Here is Snowden telling Williams how capable any well-funded intelligence agency is at tapping into cell phones.
As soon as you turn it on, it can be theirs. They can turn it into a microphone, they can take pictures from it, they can take the data off of it. But it's important to understand that these things are typically done on a targeted basis, right? It's only done when people go, this phone is suspicious.
But of course, the government's definition of suspicion is open to interpretation. To discuss last night's interview, I want to bring in Norman Solomon, Executive Director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. And here in our D.C. studio is Jesslyn Radack, Director of National Security and Human Rights at the Government Accountability Project. Thank you guys for joining me to discuss this. I want to start off by asking each of you to briefly talk about the one thing that struck you from this interview. Norman, let's begin with you.
Well, I think that Edward Snowden made very clear and underscored his independence. He has a kind of integrity that is extraordinarily historic when it's combined with a willingness and opportunity to courageously speak out, in this case, against policies of his own government. And I think his willingness to be measured in his criticism of the NSA and yet not back down at all, and also show that he's the pawn of no government and no ideology. And he quite correctly criticized the Russian and Chinese governments as well for their intrusive policies in terms of surveillance.
And Jesslyn, what was your impression?
For me, as a whistleblower attorney, I was really glad that America was able to hear more about his background, including being undercover at both the CIA and NSA, and also his attempts to go through channels internally, facts that NBC was able to get NSA to admit to. And so that argument about not going through proper channels has been a thread throughout the debate over the last year. So I thought that was really significant that he talked about how his attempts have been thwarted and really amounted to nothing.
All right, and we're bringing in another guest here, attorney Bruce Fein. Bruce, one of the things that became clear in this interview was Snowden talking about how he tried to raise these issues from within the NSA. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
The NSA has records. They have copies of emails right now to their Office of General Counsel, to their oversight and compliance folks from me, raising concerns about the NSA's interpretations of its legal authorities.
There's a FOIA out right now to find out if this is in fact true, but if it is legally, does this help his case at all?
Well, it certainly does. It shows that he wasn't reckless and immediately went to Hong Kong and disclosed the information, that he understood the rules of the game, exhausted them without result. And it gives credence to his rendition and narrative that he's not the first who's told the identical story. Tom Drake, who Jesslyn knows very well, basically confronted the same kind of problem, and that's repeated throughout the whistleblower regime. It is not the case that whistleblowers characteristically leap to go public without trying to work internally. They're not reckless people. They're conscientious. And I can state that I think Mr. Snowden's demeanor gives a special strength to his narrative. There's nothing that looks exaggerated, frantic. He doesn't use words that are display antipathy towards the United States or others, and that, like I say, strengthens the credibility of his entire story.
And Jesslyn, what do you think as an attorney yourself?
Well, actually, one of those internal complaints recently surfaced minutes before we went on air here. And again, you can kind of see, we don't have the underlying email, but the response, the first sentence of it makes sense that executive orders don't trump statutes. But the second sentence is completely nonsensical, that regulations may or may not be precedent for allowing that to happen. It's completely opaque. They don't spell the word precedent correctly, and a lot of it is redacted, and we don't even have the email chain that it's a part of. So I think you're able to see the inside the bureaucracy that you face.
Certainly a lot of vague language. Now, throughout the interview, Snowden seemed very confident that the information he released had no real harm to individuals here or abroad. But this week, of course, Secretary Kerry has been speaking about this. Let's take a listen to what he said.
What he's done is hurt his country. What he's done is expose for terrorists a lot of mechanisms which now affect operational security of those terrorists and make it harder for the United States to break up plots, harder to protect our nation.
So according to Kerry, this did hurt counterterrorism efforts abroad. A lot of people would agree with that. Norman, I want to go to you. I mean, what's your response to that? I mean, do you think that was exaggerated?
For one thing, there's no evidence that any harm has come from the revelations due to the work of Edward Snowden. Secondly, the huge damage that is done by secrecy vastly overwhelms even the claims of damage that have come from top U.S. officials in the cases of Edward Snowden as well as Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning. I think we should also recall, as a footnote, that as a senator, Mr. Kerry voted for the invasion of Iraq, an invasion based on lies, and if we'd had whistleblowers with the courage and positioned in a similar space inside the government as Edward Snowden, then perhaps the invasion of Iraq could have been avoided. So I think one of the problems with the demagoguery we're getting from Secretary of State Kerry right now is that the real threats in terms of public information from the government to the well-being and safety of Americans and others around the world come from a failure to disclose information to the public rather than the other way around.
If I could add, there's some history here as well. I remember during the Pentagon Papers disclosures, these were the 47 classified volumes of the Pentagon Papers showing the government lies about Vietnam. The government went to try to enjoin the publication, and it was said, my gosh, it'll end diplomacy, it'll be terrible to the interests of the United States. It all turned out to be false. All the post-mortem studies showed there wasn't any injury at all to the United States. Indeed, then Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird refused to sign an affidavit saying the disclosure of the Pentagon Papers would be harmful. And then more recently, the sort of predecessor to the telephony metadata collection program under 215 of the Patriot Act was something called the Terrorist Surveillance Program, initiated shortly after 9/11. It didn't even have any Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court imprimatur. And when the New York Times disclosed the program in December of 2005, it was said, my gosh, all the evasive actions that al-Qaeda is undertaking is going to terrify the people of the United States and cause all sorts of injury. And yet, despite the disclosure, there was never any showing that the New York Times publication caused any harm to anyone. Now, of course, it's obviously almost impossible to disprove a statement that, well, there's evasive action taken. Well, how do we know that? It's just, again, you have to rely upon what the NSA is saying. And remember, the NSA is part of an intelligence community led by somebody who told the Congress of the United States under oath in March 2013 that the NSA was not collecting data on millions of Americans. And we're supposed to rely upon their statements as proof of injury? That's a joke.
So, as he was saying, you have to rely on what the NSA is saying. I mean, should we take what they say at face value?
Absolutely not. Throughout this whole narrative over the last year, one person has been consistently telling the truth, and that's Edward Snowden. And a number of people have been consistently lying, and those are people associated with NSA and the intel communities. Moreover, pretty much every whistleblower in this area is smeared with the idea that they have harmed national security, that Tom Drake was going to have the blood of soldiers on his hands. Yet in Chelsea Manning's case, for example, when it came time to produce a damage assessment during the court-martial, the U.S. was unable to do so. And if you carefully parse the words that the U.S. uses when it talks about this damage, usually they couch it in terms of it might cause some damage in the future. And again, it's impossible to prove a negative. So by saying these assertions without any evidence to back it up, I don't take it at face value at all.
Right. And Norman, I heard you chime in.
Yes.
I could just
unfortunately,
add,
the track record. the track record of lying is not just from NSA and other intelligence agencies, but unfortunately also from the U.S. Department of Justice. Before Edward Snowden stepped forward, the Justice Department went to the Supreme Court and falsely asserted that the ACLU had no standing because there was no reason to believe or evidence that they were being spied on. And yet we now know that those groups and millions of others of groups and individuals were being surveilled, and yet at this moment, the Justice Department has continued to fail to do their legal duty and go back to the U.S. Supreme Court and correct the record in a 5-4 case that the Obama administration won partly on the basis of their lies. So what we have is a regime in Washington, the Obama administration, which consistently distorts and uses rhetoric to deceive the American people. And that's our situation that, fortunately, Edward Snowden and other whistleblowers are courageously seeking to counteract.
Now, at one point, hold on, just one.
If I could add, there are two other lies told to that same Supreme Court. One, it lied about the fact that it was not disclosing at that time to criminal defendants the fact that the prosecutor's evidence was derived from the NSA's warrantless surveillance, dragnet surveillance program. Secondly, it falsely stated that the only time it was intercepting the communications and emails of American citizens when they communicated as abroad was when the target of that communication was viewed as a suspected terrorist, when in fact they were intercepting any conversation from an American that mentioned the terrorist, whether or not the target was somebody else. And this is the United States Supreme Court, which historically relies upon truthfulness to reach its decisions. There's really no end to which these officials will stoop to deceive for ulterior motives.
All right, I want to move on to the next point, which is something that Edward Snowden has been accused of lying about, perhaps. Snowden was asked whether he had been approached or contacted by any officials in the Russian government. His response, of course, was no. But there are a lot of people that say it's just not possible. The former ambassador of Russia said that he's seen how Russia operates, and he knows that Snowden, it was very, very likely that Snowden had been approached. I just wanted to get your take, Norman, on why the American people should believe Snowden on this.
Well, you know, Snowden made very clear, and I think credibly so, that he entered the nation of Russia with no documents whatsoever, either on paper or digitally or on any of his computers or drives or anything else. And I think he made a persuasive case that just for his own well-being, he would have shed himself of any of that material, and he gave it to journalists before he ever arrived into Russia.
I think also you have to ask, motives. What would benefit Edward Snowden if he gave and shared this information with the Russians? He clearly would like to leave. He never had any intent to arrive there in any event. The revocation of the passport and the blockage of any entree into a Latin America country kept him there. What's his motive to lie about? How does it benefit him? And think, on the contrary, how much it benefits all of his detractors to make up or throw these insinuations out there. The fact is, if Mr. McCall has some evidence, it's got to be more than speculation. Something like that would never be admitted in a court of law as relevant to that determination of whether something had been handed over by Mr. Snowden to the Russian intelligence service.
All right, well, unfortunately, we're running out of time here, but Snowden did make it clear that he would love to come back to the United States. Of course, it's a difficult prospect, but where do you think he's going to go next? The asylum is up in June next month. Jesslyn, I'll let you take that one.
I think most likely we would ask for that asylum to be extended or for him to be granted some sort of permanent residency. We continue to have negotiations with the U.S., but there's nothing approaching something solid. And it really would have to be a negotiated settlement for him to come back, because he's not going to come back to face espionage charges under which he cannot make his case, as everybody cries all the time, just come back. When you are under prosecution for espionage, you can't raise a public interest defense or that you're a whistleblower. In fact, your motive is completely irrelevant, that you had no intent to harm the U.S. or to benefit a foreign nation.
He did say he can't face the music if the music is an unfair trial. So
exactly.
We'll have to see what happens. Bruce Fein, Norman Solomon, and Jesslyn Radack, thank you for joining us.